Yes, the gentleman down the line here.
Hello. My name is Professor Linson. I'm a neuroscientist, very much interested in the education and the governance of tomorrow. Mr. de Klerk, yes. Hello. Yes. You spoke of, you asked, what is missing? What is missing is a lack of political will, and there is a need for incentives to act. Well, I'm making a suggestion. I attended a very interesting lecture given by Nobel Prize-winning economics professor Amartya Sen at the Royal Academy of Sciences. I asked Professor Sen if world society well-being quality of life could become an international referential, changing the international mindset. Could this not serve as a strong incentive to catalyze the blending of all the disconnected and fragmented action plans and roadmaps together? He said definitely yes. Well, for this you need a new global governance infrastructure based on trust. And here I'm worried because people speak of so many projects. We must do this, we must do that. To my mind, trust first, projects second, not the other way around. And you shall not recover trust by concentrating on projects. Why? Because if the general atmosphere is plagued by suspicion and loss of trust, all these projects shall be extremely difficult to undertake and complete. So my question is, here again, how are you going to recover this lost trust?
If you'll allow me, I suggest that we take 2 or 3 questions before we give the floor to panelists. Yes. Next speaker, European Commission. Thank you. Philippe Thomas is my name. I'm from DG DevCo at the European Commission. As I only have 1.5 minutes for my remarks, I'll just say that I'm seeing a bit of a mismatch between a fairly optimistic point of view where we're looking at innovation, local approaches and so on. But I feel like this is a similar exercise to what we did in Brussels a year ago when we talked about food and energy in times of crisis. And we're saying that, yes, the planet is unwell, our system is broken, our system is certainly not sustainable. If we don't take that as our starting point, if we look at phosphate as an example, we're looking at the same situation as for oil. We'll see a consumption peak for phosphate, and then in 30 or 40 years, that depends on the estimate you look at, we won't have enough mineral phosphate for the needs of chemical farming as it currently looks. So that's another element of this transition, and this is not an option. This is something we will need to do. We're talking about things as if we already exist in a global system, which is not at all the case. We've got differences, competition for access to resources, access to financing in southern countries. This is the ACP setting, but are we looking at the same type of transition that will be needed in agriculture in all these different places? So I apologize for being quite brusque here, but we haven't really tackled any of these subjects in depth. We need to look at world trade, which will require a complete paradigm shift. How can we have low food prices in Europe? Well, because we implemented a common agricultural policy that produced a food surplus. The target was to have low prices for consumers. So we financed our food security in that way. It came at an enormous cost with significant environmental impact. We have trade distortions. We are all familiar with the negative effects of the CAP. We also know what the benefits were. But what is the challenge that we're setting ourselves here? How will we finance the transition? What are we transitioning to? I hear buzzwords such as digital. When it comes to solutions, I was in Peru a few months ago and I spoke to a farmer who was telling me about his double transition. He had transitioned in his agriculture to increase production, and then he had to reverse the process. What he said was, well, I noticed that the land was ill, it was unwell, and I realized that I was poisoning my soil, so I stopped and I reverted back, and then I managed to find somewhat of a balance. But does this allow us to really meet the challenges in terms of demography, geography, and so on? So I'm a little concerned that we, in our different meetings and settings, we repeat the same things. And I know that we're part of this same machinery. Sometimes we just end up discussing the same things. But when it comes to practical reform solutions, we need in-depth reform. If we continue to work in this way, then at some point we'll run up against a wall. And it won't happen for the northern countries, because those who are the richest are always going to be able to find a way out. Thank you. Well, I think as a part of that question, perhaps I can also add something here. It's not directed at a particular panelist, but if I may address Len Ismail as president of the Ambassadors Committee for the ACP, but also work for the OECS. Philippe mentioned the common agricultural policy. Has there been will in the Caribbean to develop a common agricultural policy to face the challenges that you mentioned? I'll give you the opportunity to respond to that from the institutional point of view as well, because what we're seeing is that we require governance changes globally, but also regionally. So have we, as southern countries, also prepared a way out here? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your experience from the Caribbean, and perhaps other panelists can respond to that as well. Other questions? Yes? If you're asking a question, make sure you speak into the microphone.
Do you agree with the statement that trade is the key to innovation? And I ask this question because next week, on the 4th of March, DEFCO InfoPoint is organizing a specific InfoPoint on the role of trade in the agricultural transformation. And the IFPRI Director General, Dr. Swinen, will be here in Brussels, which is nice. And as Philippe Thomas said, when I refer to the Food System at Risk report, which unfortunately is not downstairs, but you can download it. It is available since October. Excellent report produced by CIRAD. It's a bit worrying when I read the statement. Between 2001 and 2012, the share of processed products in the least developed countries' agricultural export has been shrinking, while the share of raw commodities in the total value of agricultural exports has increased. This sounds almost colonial times. Now, we know that innovation and trade is closely linked. It's based on trade that you innovate and produce technologies. And I mentioned also this week in Cairo, the big event on African food manufacturing exhibition, which 90% of those exhibiting in that food exhibition show are from India, China, Brazil, coming up with new technologies on packaging, on processing, but it's very rare to find African SMEs in this innovation. So what is your point out? Trade is the key for innovation.
Pour ce premier round, on va prendre une dernière question ici.
We'll take a final question for this first round, and then we'll get back to the floor after the answers.
My name is Miguel de Porras. I'm director of FIBEL Europe, which is Research Institute in Organic Agriculture. I'm very happy with the panel. I think it's very interesting, the reflection we have done here today. So I'm really grateful to especially Solina, but CTA in general for organizing this briefing, because we have seen that in general there are an agreement that yield is not the main issue. And coming to yield, I would like to mention that there was just one comment that I don't agree, that done by the speakers, I think was Mr. Caron, because he mentioned that there are lack of an alternative globalized food system. And I was past week in Biofach, I don't know if you know, it's the biggest fair in organic agriculture in Europe. And there we see that the organic farming is one of the biggest fast speed growing sectors in the world agriculture. We see that we have been talking that the need of new partnerships and partnership between public and private actors, and we see that there are global value chains working, growing, delivering what consumers are demanding, and increasing the impact. Our work can show evidence that organic agriculture have positive impacts in terms of environmental, but also in income for farmers. Even despite of the lower yields, they can maintain the incomes with the prices, prime prices. So I would like to, because it's haven't not mentioned, so organic agriculture, as other agroecological approaches, but organic is certified with globally working value chains already existing. I would like to ask to the panel what role they think that organic agriculture might have in the future of agriculture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the first question was directed to Fabrice de Klerk. We start from you, and then the others, and then Patrick Caron for the specific questions, and then of course the others can complement.
No, I think that question was about trust, and certainly not an easy question to complement. But where I've been confronted with that the most has been as a scientist trying to engage with the multiple institutions, policy, particularly private sector and civil society, where it's quite easy to destroy the reputation of a scientist simply by implying that they've collaborated with the private sector. The solution that I've found to this has been an alignment in terms of global goals. And I think that's really the key contribution that we tried to make with the Eat Lancet Commission, is to provide a universal definition of what a healthy diet is and to set the planetary boundaries for food. And the debate and the interaction that we have with the private sector is not then about those boundaries. We enter the conversation with those as being set, and we focus the conversation on what are the solutions the private sector can bring to bring foods within those boundaries and to support healthy diets. And I think that that has been a place where we can build a relationship of trust, where we can, rather than point fingers at individual companies, because they're not all equal, we can point fingers at actions and really talk about the actions and innovations that are being developed. It also allows to flip the challenge on its head in terms of recognizing, yes, there are environmental limits. These can be viewed as boundaries, but they also define the innovation space. And I think this approach has been a critical first step in building the trust, focusing on shared principles, and I think really having the critical conversations on, if we understand what health and sustainability is, what is halting progress today, and really allowing, I think, the specific references from civil society, from private sector, from policy, as to what are the lock-ins that inhibit progress, and focusing, I think, the research of scientists on helping to resolve those specific lock-ins.
Patrick Caron.
Merci. Il y a au moins quelque chose, je
Thank
pense,
you.
sur lequel on était tous d'accord.
Well, I think there's one thing we've all agreed on,
Immense transformation.
and that is that we really do need a huge transformation, to put it succinctly, and it needs to be an in-depth transformation.
Du sang, de la sueur et des larmes.
Well, that will require blood, sweat and tears.
Elle bloque sur deux paradoxes.
It is blocked by two paradoxes, as far as I've understood from these exchanges. The first is that in order to transform, we need to agree first. And as we're talking about a global transformation, we need a global agreement, whatever that means, that will be required for the governance to work. This will have to happen through institutions. And on the other hand, we all know, I think this is exactly what you referred to, that there is massive fragmentation at the moment. There's a decrease in trust in multilateral institutions that could really sow the seed for these agreements that would govern the transformation required. The second paradox that we've found, which again has been taken up in the questions is that we are investing in what is often local innovation while we are expecting global transformation. So there's a gap there and a paradox in how we actually harness those local innovations. We've all been encouraged to stimulate that, but how do we then translate that into something on the global level? A couple of the interventions mentioned this. The markets and the World Trade Organization, of course, play a significant role in this transformation. Will they hold the only keys? Certainly not. But are they part of it? Yes. To put it briefly and perhaps be somewhat provocative, trade and market is something which I love. It means that I can drink coffee and eat chocolate. Of course, I could live without these things, but it's thanks to the markets. When they are well organized, that's what allows for price regulation and transfers to deficit zones. But the condition is that trade and markets are organized. Starting from the 90s, we really had a firm belief in this, and I'm talking about international exchanges. To put a figure on it, figures have tripled from 2000 to 2012. Supply chains are currently supplied on global markets, and some say that by 2050, this will have increased even further. But markets have been thought about in this way since the 17th or 18th centuries, even though we now have institutions that are governing this, and we need this to balance the powers and increase supply on the international level. This is all good and well, but this is not the basis that we referred to this morning. So, thinking about a massive overhaul, I agree, will also mean rethinking, and this is an opportunity to rethink how we organize markets, not just to increase production and increase exchanges and trade, which was previously the solution here, but to meet all the targets that we referred to this morning when it comes to social justice, health of ecosystems, human health, different aspects of malnutrition, not just malnutrition, but when we look at obesity and the way it's spreading globally, and lack of nutrition there. So these issues have until the present time been treated as market failures or secondary effects, but these need to take a front and center stage in trade organizations if we really are serious about this transformation that we've been talking about since this morning. So to make these matters center stage means that we have to assess the different ways of organizing these markets, and we need to agree internationally. We were able to do this for health issues when it comes to livestock rearing. We have managed, and we've got a world split into two fields. We can achieve this here too, with standards and rules that will allow us to organize the markets and prepare us for this transformation that we need. And I'll just go back to what was said just now. We know that, and now again I'm repeating what's already been said, the markets don't always look the same. I'll give you two examples. On the one hand, I've got the idealistic scenario that I just mentioned. We have an opportunity here to think about, as humanity, as a way of organizing our markets that will allow us to achieve the 2030 agenda and meet the goals there. And on the other hand, looking at the coronavirus currently, but also the 15 other types of viruses that we have ahead of us, well, that will fragment the market. And if we look at these two different extremes, we'll need to build a future through agreements and efforts to mediate. And I think that relies not just on political goodwill. We need collective intelligence. And I dare hope that research will play a role there, not by issuing prescriptive standards, but through its ability to supply this collective intelligence. Thank you very much. Dr. Ismail.
Thank you very much, Viwanu. Just a couple of thoughts. I think it's very, very clear from the conversations that we've had for all of this morning and now going into the afternoon is that there can't be a blanket approach to what needs to be done. Countries are at different stages of development. Some are rich, some are poor. Countries exist in all different kinds of climatic zones. And the sort of solutions that one will find in Europe may not necessarily be the sort of solutions that one will find in the global south, for example. In some cases, the sort of financing that's required to be able to offset the sort of conversions and transformations that we're talking about, that capital will never be available. It's as simple as that. So regional realities also have to be considered. And that's what makes the ACP important as a voice and and going forward more and more as an actor on the global stage with the possibility to influence and lobby for the sort of policies that can make a difference for countries of the South. When we talk even about transformations for the use of energy, for example, the European Green Deal and the budget of $1 trillion will still have implications for people who are the most vulnerable in Europe. And yet the vulnerabilities that you find in Europe are nowhere comparable to the sort of vulnerabilities you find in the Caribbean, for example. So solutions are going to have to be real. They're going to have to be inspired by the reality of regional and domestic abilities to do what countries and regions can do. I think that's the first thing. I mean, with all of the discussions we have, there's a point at which one has to also be pragmatic in terms of the solutions that one is talking about. For a very long time, the developing world was consumed, and even in the Caribbean, with the need to break into global value chains, because we all know trade is a vehicle to sharing prosperity and all of those sort of things. Liberalization of trade caused huge problems for national treasuries in all of the Caribbean because taxes on trade provided 50% of government operating revenues. Very hard to be able to talk about diversification. When small islands lost bananas, we were told by USAID, for example, that's okay, turn your farmers into bellmen and busboys in the tourism industry. Well, it's not something that happens overnight. The investments in human capital usually require 20 years. So there's an issue also of scale, not only one of affordability. And we did a lot by way of breaking into global value chains, but at the expense of taking a look at what was happening to internal regional markets, like the Caribbean, for example. We negotiated trade agreements all over the world, but the level of intra-regional trade for a long time was no more than 7 and 8%. Agriculture right now was 17% of intra-regional trade. 10, 12 years ago, it's down to 12%, and it's going down every single year. We've never thought of domestic consumption as something that we need to build and focus on. So we've left the regional internal markets, and the same thing can be said for Africa. One of the hopes for Africa is the African Continental Free Trade Area. The obstacles are humongous, but it's a huge market that when it is actually broken and Africa starts producing for its own domestic consumption, its own domestic markets, there will not be any holding back of that continent. So we're a little bit of a conundrum. The advice given to developing countries was get into that value chain and feed global markets. And yet when you don't feed yourself, there's a problem. And there's a conundrum right now that we are facing in a very, very real way with small producers and farmers who will never have economies of scale. And we've left them behind. We've not focused on the sort of targeted policies and support that's required to bring them on board. And yet we say they're the engine of growth. Somewhere along the line, I think there are very honest conversations that we need to have. We talk at a very high level, but there's a point at which there is a level of pragmatism that needs to be had in all of our circles, whether it's at Davos, whether it's at the UNGA, whether it's in this house, or wherever it is, about practically what can be done. There's no end of action plans. And tiny countries, quite frankly, administratively, do not have the resources to keep on every year reporting on all of the action plans that the rest of the world tells them if they are party to somehow magically their way of life and their people will be transformed. It doesn't happen that way. So the only point that I would like to make is that we have sacrificed internal domestic consumption, internal regional markets for something called globalization, and I'm all for it. I'm also an development economist, so I understand the importance of trade. But there is a balance which we have not yet had, and an honesty in our discussions. Not quite sure where it will come, but all of us here should be ambassadors for that kind of honest delivery and honest conversation, which I think we're going to need to have in the future.
Well, thank you. Avant de continuer, demander.
Before I continue, may I ask our interpreting colleagues to give us a few minutes so that we go into detail as regards the replies and just have a smaller round of questions before we wind up. I guarantee we won't go beyond 1:30.
Big forum. Are you helping to rebalance the global governance? Anything to add to what has been said?
I think, I mean, we've talked, I think the tension between trying to address a global, the need for a global food system transition, and at the paradox, as you said, between also the fact that this requires very different local interpretation of that is going to be one of the most critical challenges that we face. And I think, you know, we are, as the World Economic Forum, to try and think through, right, how do we do this in a way that does follow a principled approach, you know, which is very much, you know, and what does that mean? And how can you create the kind, what we're going to need to see is a whole rethink around leadership, not just classic leadership in the traditional sense, a head of state who, you know, comes up, or a head of an organization, but to break these silos, both vertically in terms of climate change or nutrition, or global versus local, or blended finance versus ODA, etc., is going to require a new generation of systems leaders. And we're seeing that coming through at the farmer organization level, which is really exciting, where people are taking a much more holistic approach. And so Elizabeth's counterpart in SACAO, they're looking at how can they have, say, a whole poultry-wide initiative across all of their members, you know, but look at this from a health systems, food systems, financing, and value chain perspective at the same time. You know, what you're doing with e-granaries, you know, where you're looking at this in terms of data transfer and all of that requires, I mean, these require leadership coming through at the farmer organization level, at the community level, at the national level and the global level that we don't have at the moment. We see pockets of systems leadership, but we do not see this at scale. And so that would be, I hope, as the World Economic Forum, together with a range of partners, I really think that, I hope that we can contribute to a next generation of helping towards that next generation of systems leadership. Because without that, we will be trapped in these traditional silos. And I think that the final thing I just want to say, I don't need to make another comment, is I would also support what Marissa Ryan was saying, to the EU, in the sense that there is, I think, for the Food Systems Summit, in a way, I see an unprecedented opportunity to use this in a dynamic way, but it will require quite a lot of inclusion to make that happen over the next 18 months. And so we need to think out of the box a little bit, how that can be done by the partners of the EU to maybe act in quite a light-footed, quick way to really bring that about. If we're going to really use this food summit to be something that is actually transformational in itself, rather than just the usual meeting with some nice statements and some nice commitments being made, but actually leads to something genuine. But it will require that, and there is an opportunity for the European Union to really take leadership in helping to make that happen at a global level.
Any other contribution, Elizabeth? Nothing can happen without the farmers. It's all about you. So.
Yeah, my comments, someone raised an issue on the role of organic agriculture in shaping the future of our agriculture and food systems. I think I would say yes, as long as there are incentives that are tagged to that. When you look at, for example, products that are being sold on fair trade, you will realize that most farmers, most cooperatives and farmers associations are selling organic products because of the incentive that comes with it. They are looking at the second payment, for example, the social premium that comes, with a fair trade arrangement. And then just to add to what my colleagues had said on the issue of trade as being a key driver to innovation, I think we can look at it in terms of the profit and loss balance sheet and the cost of investment vis-a-vis the return on investments. And all this is again determined by the availability of the market, the profitability of the market, and also the sustainability of the market. Where you have sustainable and profitable market, yes, innovations will always, be brought on board, because farmers know, not only farmers, but everyone will know that I already have a market where I'm going to sell the product. But where you're just trading and not necessarily making profit, then it may not really contribute to innovation. Yeah, thank you.
Marissa, you are saying 2 words?
2 words. Smallholder farmer. No, I agree with Monsieur Thoma that, of course, there are many problems and we can be often recurring around the same conversation topics. But for us, we really believe that the problem and the main obstacle is actually political leadership. We have the solutions. We know that at local level, there are solutions that can be applied regionally and nationally, that smallholders are at the forefront of that they can harness some of the things that we've been talking about in innovations in digital and so on. But until we give them agency and use this idea of agency as the 5th pillar of food and nutrition security, we won't be able to make progress. So I think for as long as we refuse, and as Sean pointed out, we're not showing leadership politically in making advances in this agenda, we will continue to struggle and we will find ourselves back here next year for sure. But I would urge everyone to take that into account in the agenda.
Deuxième round de questions.
Second round of questions. Yes, Mr. Labouré.
Hello, Michel Lavolée, Public-Private Partnerships Europe. I want to pick up on many of the comments made earlier, but just to indicate a very strong frustration at the fact that partnerships are falling through the cracks in this discussion, is how you actually work together to achieve the common goals that we're all talking about, and to be practical, as you mentioned, Len, the house is on fire in Africa and small island states when you look at the combination of climate change, insecurity, this vicious cycle that's taking the Sahel down the tubes, basically, with, it's not about a blanket statement that malnutrition and food insecurity is an issue. It's an issue more particularly in certain countries, and it's getting worse. So what I'm saying is that to actually bring those solutions that are practical, you need to have private sector, civil society, governments work together towards common goals. Sean knows well that these are things that we achieved in HIV 20 years ago, but that story is forgotten. Who remembers that? And the other point I want to bring in is that we have not heard about job creation through innovation, and clearly working with the private sector is the major solution. It's not governments that are going to be creating the new jobs that you're going to negotiate with youth in the future, working with farmers' organizations, NGOs, to actually create this new segment of capacity and application of innovation. So this is not being discussed. I think that there are practical things that can be done, that can show that there are already solutions, but you have to bring the stakeholders together to work on common goal. And partnership is the solution. Blending is not the solution. Blending is an instrument. But having a partnership agenda is the solution to bring, the stakeholders together, create a safe space, and agree on what you can do together better than separately.
Une dernière question.
Last question.
Monsieur.
Yes, the gentleman over there.
Oui, je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Jean-Dominique Kamba.
Jean-Dominique Kamba. I am a farmer.
Je tiens d'abord à rendre hommage
Let me praise the women here. I love women because they are pragmatic and they cut to the quick. They have taught me a lot. Begin with my mother. Well, I didn't know her much because she died when I was 5 years old. But this is the 60th briefing, and then that's it. I think we need to engage in some self-assessment in order to build something. Otherwise, Africans will collapse because of the debt burden. So I have a simple question. Now that there will be no more Brussels briefings, how can we, as farmers, how can we generate the trust which was broken? There's no longer any trust. There are lots of experts and NGOs in developing countries. Or what is the farmer expecting? The farmer is expecting something, and he gets something a little bit, but when the expert leaves, that's it. So if we don't draw the necessary conclusions from such failures, why is Africa, why does Africa still require assistance? It's difficult to feed your family. Why? Does it mean that the Africans don't understand anything? I don't think so. Because we didn't put our trust in the farmers. How can you change the mindset of an expert who goes into the field and who is supposed to listen rather than impose anything? You know that experts and doctors have used the knowledge of farmers and have been using that since the world exists. And they have put a proper format on it in order to get the appropriate titles. So let us be modest. Let us change the paradigm, the mindset. If you don't change mentalities, you won't go any further. There will be a further failure. And we would be ashamed of having had such meetings of being an expert. What has not been done for the people who are the most affected, men and women farmers who feed the world? So there's a word I want us to change in this self-assessment. How are you going to proceed in order to bring forward the dynamic of the development process to the local process? The ladies here spoke about concrete elements. So what are you going to do in order to bring development to the local level? What are you going to do in order to break all those lobbies who come with their organic products, etc., etc.? Well, all they need to focus on is the agriculture and the farmers. Yes, there is added value, but does that benefit the local farmer? So let me finish. What is going to happen to us tomorrow? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Je pense que vous nous avez tous ramenés sur terre.
Well, I think you have brought us back down to earth, to the essence. In many cases, consultants take your watch from you and tell you what time it is. So,
whoever wants to take la question n'est dirigée à personne, mais
the question is not put to anyone in particular.
On partnership, I mean, I can talk to this a little bit. I think we do need to rethink the way that and focus on some of these partnership models. I mean, the Sahel is a good point. I mean, this is, you know, there is a climate crisis in the Sahel. There is a whole dislocation, rural to urban, you know, migration, etc. At the same time, it's not big enough to be a political only issue. It's not big enough to be a humanitarian only issue. At the same time, you need private sector investment. You need local communities to take ownership of that development, as was just being expressed. That will not happen through one partnership. So you actually need to start to look at the partnership models to actually look at how do different partnerships overlay and complement each other. How do you create the docking points between different partnerships so that they can link up, you know, the way that, you know, it's a bit like what is the green mat for Lego, if anyone has children. I had children. You know, the Lego pieces on their own mean nothing if you do not have a green mat, you know, that you can actually put all the pieces to, that can connect all of the different pieces. And so how do we build that green mat for partnership building so that all of these different partnerships don't become random projects, but actually become part of a ecosystem for change? And I think that's what you're talking to, and that is going to require us really rethinking in many ways how we traditionally have worked together based on a project mentality or a traditional one or two organizations, partners working together mentality, and to think much more as an ecosystem approach to partnership development.
Ouais, sur cette question du partenariat,
well, on this issue of partnership, I didn't quite understand your frustration because I get the impression that that's all we've been speaking about this morning. Maybe we didn't use enough words. When you speak about major transformation, governance, and as one of the pillars for redefining the view of food security, it doesn't matter what level. That's what we've been speaking about all morning. We're speaking about the trust to be built between the various stakeholders in order to carry out that transformation. So if it is necessary to repeat it, fine, we can repeat it, but I'm sure that we are at the heart of the matter, and we haven't been going around in circles. What we have seen, a strong position being adopted here. My conviction is that when you're talking about the territory itself, the land, that is where you can start building. I spoke about the market just now, but it's not a matter only to be dealt with at the global level or international level. It has to be dealt with at all levels and deal with it in an intelligent way by articulating the various levels where such partnerships can be built. Now, when I keep speaking about the territorial level, the local level, you can, yes, rebuild the trust, you can be innovative, you can see the seeds of a new international cooperation. It's a strong position. But I said as well that it's not just a matter of changing scales. No. We have to work in the form of partnership, not by accepting all forms of condition. When you talk about a multi-stakeholder partnership, yes, that's interesting, but not under certain specific conditions. So it depends on the conditions that are put. In a country such as mine, obviously, we need to avoid, this may be a caricature, but farmers call urban consumers bourgeois, and the bourgeois, or people in the urban areas, call farmers poisoners of the land. So we have to rebuild the partnership at the local level and also put it at the international level. I think of the Committee on Food Security, where one of the latest reports relating to the food system proposed an agreement to be entered into in October 2020 relating to new voluntary guidelines for food security. This is the time to think about it at the global level while building at the grassroots level. And of course, you have the summit, the upcoming summit, which will be an extraordinary moment to bring together this collective conscience. Just a final word. A final word. I am not a woman. That is evident. But when the word expert or science is used, it's not to just get a title or get additional qualifications. I advocate the contrary. You use that form of knowledge, like other forms of knowledge, in building a collective intelligence. So I couldn't not react to this. I'm saying this with great humility. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce Patrick's point is that all I've seen for the past 2 years is a growing number of partnerships. And I think there's a collective complacency that we need to recognize. And yes, sometimes the private sector misbehaves. And yes, policy is too slow. And yes, science has a tendency to lecture. And so as a scientist, I think that what we've seen and what we've tried to do in many of our science solution dialogues is to say, sit down and listen. We've defined the safe space. And Patrick, I think you spoke to scientists as inventors and with good imagination. I've actually found that that's where we struggle the most, and where sitting down and listening to cities, listening to farmers, listening to private sector, we've been able, or we have an opportunity to really revise what questions we're asking, which are the critical questions. And so I think that in developing pathways, don't count on the scientists to develop the pathways alone. They will tell you what the impact of your pathway is, but they fundamentally depend on cities and companies and civil society to help define those pathways. I'm hugely impressed by the city of Paris. which 2 years ago published a food strategy that talks about climate, that talks about water quality, that talks about hunger, that talks about obesity, that has a flexitarian diet, that wants more food from their territoire, and that just last week said we're going to pay 39 million euros in order to help the farmers in the Parisian watershed transition to organic because we want improved water quality. And so these are the kinds of integrated partnerships that I see emerging. The European Green Deal, Leonard, we're all hoping that this is another example of how we partner on these multiple issues, but that's exactly the name of the game now on. I think the real struggle is that we're transitioning from very linear approaches to doing development and progress to non-linear approaches, systems-based ones, and that we're still caught in a frame where we're asked to report on linear-based outcomes. And I think the major transition that we have now is how do we do that? And I know the EU Horizon 2020 projects have been listening. They've been calling for more integrated, co-created research projects. It failed last year, but I think it's going to work this year. There's echoes that the next funding tranche will be over longer time periods because you can't do systems research over 3 years, and that it's going to require integration across agriculture, environment and health, cities and scientists. And so I think that, at least on the European front, I see some very important signs that partnerships are now the name of the game.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que,
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contribution and all the comments coming from the floor. I think we can put a lid on this discussion. Isolina's talked about submitting some figures. I promise the interpreters that we won't go beyond 1:30. It's 27 minutes past, but maybe you can just get the figures and close.